Hello everyone, welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to continue our discussion on image interpretation, talking about the element of shadow. Now, shadow plays a fairly substantial role, not just in terms of the way that we're going to be talking about it here, but in the way that it sort of accentuates some of the other aspects like shape and texture and pattern, and makes those things more visible. But in this case, when we're talking about shadow, we're really talking about the size and shape of the shadow of an object, or the lack of shadow. Right? Because not every object is going to have a shadow, and not having a shadow is a very strong indication that the object is very close to the ground. Like, for example, you wouldn't expect a lawn or the actual field of an athletic facility to cast a shadow, right? And that's a good indication that's actually on the ground. So in that case, the lack of a shadow is just as important as the size and shape of an existing shadow. And what I want to do is I want to go through some examples and talk about why shadows are so useful. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go through this striking example of shadow that you've probably seen before. This is an example of a National Geographic image, but it's not exclusive to National Geographic. And this is certainly the kind of thing that you can get with ultra-high spatial resolution remote sensing. And so what I want to do here is I want to draw your attention to the fact that the animal itself is right here. Right? And if the shadow was gone and all you had were these animals here, you'd have a very hard time figuring out what they were. I mean, you may be able to infer it if you knew where the image was taken and a couple of other key variables, right? But just think about how much easier your life is when you can see the shadow right here, right? When you can see the fact that this animal right here creates this shadow right here, and you can see this very distinctive outline, right? I'm tracing it as best I can here. Right, but even with my badly traced outline, you certainly already know this is a camel, right? And I'm not even that good at drawing. So you can see here that shadow plays a key role with certain elements in certain objects, and it certainly helps with most objects. But in a case like this, right, it's one of the key features to being able to quickly identify these as camels. Right? Just imagine for a second that these shadows weren't here. How much harder of a time you would have figuring out what this was. So this is sort of a very strong example. Let's go through some examples that may not quite be as strong, but that are still really useful. And I want to draw your attention to this image right here. And as always, I want to compare three different regions. The first region I want to look at is this region right here. Right? And what you see is that there really isn't a shadow. Right? No real shadow. And in addition to, color and pattern that we've already talked about, right? You would hopefully infer that this is some sort of a manicured lawn or field or landscape. Now I want you to compare that to the region right next to it, right? This region right here. Now, we've already kind of talked about this idea that, maybe there's a pattern here. This texture is definitely rougher. And maybe you might think that this would be some sort of an orchard, and it might be. But the idea here is that this is definitely smaller. Right, this is definitely small / young trees. Whether it's an orchard that somebody's cultivating, or maybe it's a regrowth forest, right, where someone's planted trees in an attempt to generate more forested area in this region. We don't know that for sure, but we can definitely tell, just from the fact that there is very little shadow, right? This has no shadow. This has very little shadow, right? So this is indicative that this is maybe a new growth area, or this is an area where forest is attempting to take hold. So now compare that to this area down here, right? This area sort of that's around everything. Right? So now compare that where we have these deep pockets, right? Deep pockets of shadow. So these are older, taller. Let's try not to butcher the word older there. Right? These are older, taller, most likely more mature trees. Right? And one of the reasons that we know that is because we see these deep pockets of shadow here. Again, I'm just highlighting a couple of them. Right? We see these deep pockets of shadow here that we don't see. We see some small little pockets of shadow. Right? We see some small little pockets of shadow here, but nothing to the same level as these nice big deep pockets that we see here. And then again, here we don't see any shadow, right? Because that's indicative that this is basically at ground level. So hopefully that makes sense, this idea that in the context of a mature growth forest, right, we see these deep pockets of shadow. In the context of this small or young trees, which again, this could be an orchard. My guess is it's probably a replanting of some sort, where the trees haven't had a chance to establish, right? We don't see those same deep pockets of shadow. And then when we have zero trees, right, this is a field or a lawn of some sort, right? We see no real shadow here. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, this is another example of where we can use shadow. And the last thing that I want to talk about is individual trees. All right, and so we've got some examples. Let me zoom up just a little bit here. All right. So I have sort of really zoomed in, so I apologize if they're really blurry here. But what I want to do is I want to just quickly draw out something and show you what I'm talking about. All right, so let's assume we have 2 different trees, or 3 different trees, right? We have this tree, we have this tree, and then we have this tree. Right? And so we have the sun, right? The sun shining. Pretend that this is even. Again, not always the best art here. I'm going to draw the shadow in white because we have a black background here, right? But we would expect the shadow of this tree, right, to look something like that. Right? We would expect the shadow of this tree to look something like that. And then we would expect the shadow of this tree, right, to look something like that. So you can see just in my sort of artistic rendering here, right, that individual trees cast very different shadows. And so this may not be the best example, but once you get farther along in your image interpretation career, right, you'll get to the point where you can actually start to identify different tree types and even different species, depending on the region, based on the shadows that you see from individual trees. Right, so this is a good example. I tried to find examples of these 3 sort of setups here, where in this image, right, we have, I'm going to use red to outline the tree, right? Our tree is something like this. And I'm going to use blue here to outline the shadow, right? The shadow is something like this. So you can see the tree is kind of rounded, and the shadow is also kind of rounded. So this would likely be, and again, I don't know this for sure. I'm not an expert image interpreter. That's not my area of expertise. But this would likely be what is called a deciduous tree. And in case you don't know what deciduous means that it loses its leaves in the fall. Right? These are the trees that change color and you end up having to rake your lawn. Right? This is a deciduous tree. And we can tell that because deciduous trees tend to have a sort of rounded shape. Right? They look more like this. And then their shadow as a result is sort of this oblong, lopsided little shape here. Now, if we compare that to this example here, right, where the tree looks something like this here, and again, I apologize if these are a little blurry. I was trying to zoom in to make the trees more noticeable. But you can see here that the shadow has this distinct cone shape. So again, I'm not an expert image interpreter, but this right here is likely, oops, hope if I could spell properly. This is likely an evergreen. Right, and again, these don't lose their leaves, and they tend to have this sort of pine tree, like think Christmas tree. Right, they have a Christmas tree shape. And in this one, right, the tree is right here. Right, but the shadow again is right here. And you can see here that comparing this one to this one, right, this shadow is a lot more sort of broken up. It's a little more fragmented. Right, that's an indication that maybe these leaves aren't as close together as they are here. And this would be indicative of a different type of species. Right, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm not necessarily expecting you to memorize this diagram or memorize these specific examples here. But the idea I'm trying to get across is that when you have individual trees, right, that their shadows can be very telling about what type of tree it is. And if you're really good and you know the area really well, you can even start to get down to individual species. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, don't overcomplicate it. Again, just trying to get across the idea that the shape of a shadow can be very important. If any of this did not make sense, please reach out. Thank you.